Pangetahuan, Restructuring ජීවිතේ.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there and a very good evening. Welcome to Newsfirst Newsline here on TV1. We are coming to you live and direct from our studios in Colombo. I'm W.A.Wijewardena for the Newsfirst team joining you tonight. Tonight's topic of discussion will center around Sri Lanka's economic recovery and the status of Sri Lanka's economy. And to discuss all the matters pertaining to this subject, we have invited Dr. W.A.Wijewardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, via Zoom. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining me this evening to discuss this pertinent topic.
Thank you very much, Jamal, for having me on your program.
Doctor, on the outset of the program, I want to ask you, in your expert opinion, do you think that Sri Lanka is on a path towards economic recovery? Do you see any sort of progress?
No, the answer to your question, Jamal, is no, because the economic crisis which Sri Lanka faces is so grave and so acute. You cannot have, a solution overnight. It takes, I think, many years for Sri Lanka to have a recovery because if you look at the external sector, what has actually happened is that the foreign reserves of the central bank, they have come to a virtually zero level if you look at the usable foreign reserves. But on top of that, the central bank's foreign reserves are negative to the extent of $4.8 billion US as at the end of July. So that means if any recovery in foreign exchange is to be made by the central bank, it has to first fill this negative gap.
Yeah.
Then if you look at the budget, Jamal, the budget is overdrawn. The consolidated fund is an overdrawn account in the treasury. The overdrawn amount is about, say, 1 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. So what it means is that the government has lost its space to spend any money for any welfare measure or even for economic development. When it comes to economic growth, the banning of the essential inputs and spare parts and machinery by the recent gazette notification by the government has virtually crippled the entire industrial sector. Even though some of the items have been removed subsequently, it still affects the economic growth. So we are actually not on a path to recovery, but of course, in my view, we are moving backward now because the inflation rate is around 65%, no foreign reserves, and there is no any prospect of getting any loan from outside unless we get this IMF bailout. So when it comes to all these, factors, I think we are not on a recovery path, but actually we are moving backward now.
So, Doctor, while all of this is happening in Sri Lanka, we know that the 51st session of the UNHRC is happening in Geneva, Switzerland, and Sri Lanka has been placed on the spotlight once more in terms of the resolution that was brought against Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, Doctor. But this time there seems to be a very interesting development where the UN seems to be trying to charge Sri Lanka of economic crimes, which seems to be a unique topic to charge Sri Lanka with. What is your opinion on this, Doctor? What sort of ramifications will this have?
Well, Jamal, I think this for the first time in the history of Sri Lanka that an outside body is trying to charge Sri Lanka on the ground of economic crimes. But of course, what the allegations made by the UN Human Rights Commission have some foundation, because we are heading towards an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in the form of shortage of foods, medicine, fuel, and all other essential items because of the erroneous economic policies adopted by Sri Lanka's economic policy makers. So on top of that, there had been this banning of the chemical fertilizers and pesticides in an attempt to convert Sri Lanka's agriculture to
an organic agricultural policy.
Farming it has crippled the agriculture sector also. That is one of the reasons why we have lost the agricultural output. So when it comes to this kind of a thing, Jayamal, this is actually a subject discussed under the topic called democratic economic policy governance. So in terms of the democratic economic policy governance, there must be some accountability for the economic action taken by all the rulers. And unfortunately for Sri Lanka, the action taken by the previous economic policy makers had not been in the best interest of the country. So in fact, it has given Sri Lanka to the present economic catastrophe. So it's the first time that an outside body, I think for the first time even in the history of United Nations, that is trying to charge a member country for economic crimes and also trying to establish accountability there. It's not good development for Sri Lanka, Jayamal.
So, Doctor, in terms of prosecuting or trying to charge perpetrators who are responsible for economic crimes, how would they go about prosecuting such individuals? Will they attempt to, if such a matter does come forward, would they attempt to recover the money from the wrongdoers? How would that happen, Doctor?
No, Jayamal. The United Nations has no any mandate to go and make charges against any of the citizens in the in a member country. What has actually happened is that it is actually giving a warning signal to the present administration in Sri Lanka that it cannot ignore anymore about the catastrophic developments that have taken place as a result of this human error. And it is up to the government of Sri Lanka to take action against all the culprits, because we cannot for the time being, Jayamal, say that these people are guilty. But it has to be found out, and if it is found out, then the government of Sri Lanka will have to decide how it would try to, compensate for the losses that it has caused to Sri Lanka's economy. It's up to government of Sri Lanka. It's a warning given to the government of Sri Lanka, and I don't think United Nations might, come and, try to institute charges against any of these people in Sri Lanka, because that is beyond their mandate.
So, Doctor, we saw Foreign Minister Ali Sabri in Geneva categorically denying the conclusions and the statement that was presented by the UNHRC in terms of Sri Lanka with regards to Sri Lanka. Do you agree with this approach of the government, Doctor?
Well, of course, Jayamal, this has been the practice throughout its, post-independence history. Whenever somebody outside making a charge against the government or against the country, they always, try to defend their position. But they had been, the consequences of some, irreparable damage to the reputation of the country. So this time also, irrespective of the fact that, countries headed by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, they are taking the same, taking the same defense line, which will not be actually appreciated by the people outside the country. So we will have to wait until the final voting at Human Rights Commission takes place to find out how many countries would have agreed with Sri Lanka and how many countries would not have agreed with Sri Lanka. So if there are, larger number of countries which have not agreed, then of course it's again a message delivered to the government headed by Ranil Wickremesinghe as president to take immediately the corrective action.
Doctor, let's come back to Sri Lanka. Recently in Parliament, the Social Security Contribution Levy was passed. However, it divided opinion and drew a lot of criticism for the way it had been structured. Doctor, what is your opinion on that?
Well, this particular social security levy was not actually proposed in the interim budget of President Ranil Wickremesinghe. It was proposed by the 2022 budget presented by Basil Rajapaksa in Parliament last year. But what has actually happened is, these social security contributions have become one of the important sources of revenue in countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, even in USA, because it is actually a way for the government to ensure the old age security for the aging population of the country. In Sri Lanka, what has been done, Jayamal, is it has been used as a source of revenue for the government, and also since it is imposed on not on the value added but on the final turnover of a company exceeding $100 million. And so it has a cascading effect, because what has been, for example, imposed on an imported item at 2.5%, will end up around at 7% at the level of the retail trade. So this is a very damaging thing, but if the government had been interested in earning income, what the government would have done, Jayamal, is without damaging the country's economy and the initiative for the private sector to engage in economic activities, they would have simply increased the turnover value-added tax from 15% to 20%. Now this has become an additional burden on the consumers of the country, because the cascading effect would affect at the retail level at around say 7% of the retail thing, and if it is passed on to the consumers, the consumer prices will go up unnecessarily.
Staying on the same topic, Doctor, I want to talk to you about inflation. We know that when taxes are raised and subsidies are slashed, inflation occurs because there are demand side and supply side factors, and this might be a supply side factor that causes inflation to further increase. How can the government better manage the inflation in the country?
Well, of course, I'll have to make a clarification on that point, Jaimal, because the whatever the increases in the cost of production would result in an increase in the cost of living of the people. It doesn't generate inflation unless that inflation is validated by central bank by printing new money. Now, inflation, Jaimal, is a result of the past monetary policy practices by the central bank. And if you take the period from December 2019, in which the Gotabaya became the president, till July 2022, the latest month for which data are available, the total increase in money supply has been about say 4.4 trillion Sri Lanka rupees, which is an increase of about say 55% of the total money supply.
Right.
So what it means is that money is in circulation, and it is that money which is causing inflation. But any slashing of the subsidies or increase in the taxes will cause the cost of living of the people to go up for one time. But if the central bank is very serious, and if it is very careful not to accommodate it by printing new money, that will die out immediately. But if central bank tries to accommodate it by printing new money, what would happen is we would be heading towards hyperinflation, because right now we have a galloping inflation where inflation would jump from one point to another. But if the central bank would keep on increasing money supply in order to accommodate the requirements of the economy, what would happen is we are heading towards hyperinflation in Sri Lanka, which is very much damaging to Sri Lanka's future.
Doctor, I want to talk to you about the central bank as well. We know that the IMF delegation that was here in Sri Lanka had presented some conditions before they reached a SAF level agreement to disperse 2.9 billion US dollars to Sri Lanka. They spoke particularly about ensuring central bank independence. Do you think the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is independent? And if not, how important and how can we go about ensuring that central bank independence is stored or restored?
Well, Jayamal, compared to say Bank of Ceylon or People's Bank, which are state bank, central bank enjoys a greater degree of independence. But what has mattered in the recent past has been that the political intervention in the affairs of the central bank, specifically when conducting monetary policy and the final sector stability policy, the monetary board has lost its independence, and what the IMF is asking the government is to restore it. To do that, we'll have to replace the present Monetary Act under which the central bank has been established with the new central banking law, in which the government's intervention in the affairs of the central bank we should have to be brought to a zero level. At the same time, the freedom the autonomy which the monetary board or the central bank is enjoying presently will have to be increased up to 100% level. So this is what has been suggested by IMF, and of course President Ranil Wickremesinghe, when he presented the interim budget for the next 4-month time period, he had announced in his budget that he would take action to make central bank independent. So that's a salutary development in my view.
Do we require a fresh central bank act, Doctor, or the current regulations sufficient to ensure central bank independence?
We need the fresh act, Jayamal, because in the present legal structure of the central bank, there's an anomaly, because even though we talk about this institution called central bank, before the law, there is no an institution called central bank, because what has been incorporated by the Monetary Act is not the central bank, but the Monetary Board of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. If anybody wants to take this particular institution to courts, it has to take not the central bank, but the Monetary Board. So we need a new act in which it is the central bank which is being incorporated, not the Monetary Board.
Right.
And at the same time, provide many other provisions to ensure that the appointment of the governor and appointment of the Monetary Board members and the tenure of the senior officers like deputy governors will have to be ensured by law. And at the same time, to reduce the central bank's lending to government to a minimum level, because right now central bank can lend up to an unlimited amount by buying treasury bills to the government, by also printing money, and that is what has been charged by many people in the country in the recent past. To ensure all these new provisions, it is necessary that we should have a new central banking law rather than amending the existing Monetary Law Act.
Right. We are in conversation with Dr. W.A. Wijewardena. However, we must now cross over to take a look at tonight's headlines. We will be right back. Stay tuned.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Newsfirst headlines. Main sponsor.
Anka eke araksita itigini petti. Surya gini petti.
Sri Lanka begins talks with Australia on renewable energy investments. Cost of living hits new high as hotels and restaurants face closure. Core group on Sri Lanka releases draft resolution with mounting concerns on human rights. Lawyers charged for tooting horn to Kapatu tune released by court. US will continue to speak up for democracy, says ambassador. 20 million rupees in damages to president's office due to protest.
Newsfirst headlines. Main sponsor.
Anka eke araksita itigini petti. Surya gini petti. Lovatama eliya denna dilena Surya. Amataka vinnema නැති නමගේ Surya. Kohotin දැල්වෙන ගිනි කුර Surya. Kavadat namagat gini petti Surya. Kavadat namagat gini petti Surya. Kavadat kotanat samage vishwasya dinagat anka eke araksita iti gini petti. Surya gini petti.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there and welcome back to Newsline here on TV1. We are currently in conversation with Dr. W.A. Wijewardena. Doctor, I want to speak to you about the appropriation bill for the next year, for 2023. We know that the budget will be presented in November this year. What sort of allocations and what sort of proposals would ideally be presented by the government in the upcoming budget, Doctor?
Well, there is this requirement that Sri Lanka will have to go for a surplus in its primary account of the budget at 2.5% by year 2025, which is a requirement under the current negotiations with IMF. In order to attain this particular requirement, Jayamal, we have to start right from year 2023.
Right.
Therefore, there is no any space available for government of Sri Lanka to increase its recurrent expenditure except the interest income. So what we mean by primary account is, Jamal, the total expenditure of the government except the interest payments as against the total revenue of the government, which has to be in surplus at about, say, 2.5%. With what it means is the government's purchase of goods and services from the economy cannot be increased anymore, and at the same time government will have to increase its income level also, and it has to therefore go for a very austerity budget in year 2022. That's number one. Number two is that there are these, monsters in the government sector, all the state-owned enterprises, which are making losses year after year. And those losses will have to be contained, and they are brought back to zero level and then converted to profitable institution. So the 2023 budget will have to present a plan which should enable the government to restructure most of these loss-making enterprises like, Ceylon Electricity Board, Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, Sri Lankan Airlines, and so forth. So this is another requirement in the budget of 2023, because we have to lay foundation for the conversion of these institutions to profitable institutions in the future. The third one is, even though some of the revenue proposals have been presented in the interim budget by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, as well as some proposals he made, when he was the Prime Minister in June this year, they are not adequate to increase the revenue level of the government.
Right.
That is because we are getting only about 8% of GDP as revenue, which have to be increased to 12% by year 2023. So what it means is the government will have to go for additional revenue measures to increase the total revenue of the government. So what it means is, Jayamal, the budget for 2023 would be basically an austerity budget where people will have to be asked to tighten their belts. And when it comes to tighten belts, Jayamal, I will have to say, that should come from president downwards to the man in the street. So everybody will have to tighten their belt in terms of handout budget. It should not be a handout budget. It should be an austerity budget as far as I am concerned.
Doctor, talking about state-owned enterprises, you mentioned that talking about the budget as well. We know that there are many state-owned enterprises that are bleeding money, that is squandering public funds, Doctor. So how can the government go about speaking to anti-reform groups and also either privatizing or appealing to these groups to enter public-private partnerships and to make these state-owned enterprises or these enterprises as a whole profit-making entities?
Well, I think there's a salutary development, Jayamal, because the present government, despite the opposition by many people in the country, they have revised the prices of the petroleum production, the fares tariff of the Ceylon Electricity Board, tariff of the Water Board, and also the Railway Department, and also the bus fares to reflect the cost, which is a good development. I will have to uphold what the government has done.
Right.
But what matters here is that the government does not have any money to recapitalize these institutions, because as I mentioned to you, the budget 2023 and beyond should be austerity budgets, and there is no any space for the government to capitalize them through transfers from the treasury.
Right.
So what it means is, as you have very correctly identified, we have to get capital from outside, from the private sector in Sri Lanka or from people outside Sri Lanka. In order to do that, one of the most important requirements that we have to do it, because they have accumulated losses right now, and those losses will have to be taken out of the balance sheets of these organizations and passed on to some independent entity, maybe a special purpose vehicle, specifically created for that purpose. The losses will have to be transferred, cleaned, the balance sheet should be cleaned, and then only we have to invite the outside parties to come and put their capital there. Because right now, what would happen is that if we invite the outsiders to come and put capital, Jayamal, it is like, watering a sinking well.
Right.
Whatever the water that put to a sinking well will dry up immediately. Similarly, the money that would come into these organizations will also dry up immediately. So I think the budget 2023 will have to come up with a viable proposal to take out the accumulated losses, transfer them to a special purpose vehicle specifically created for that purpose, and that money we can be, written off annually over a period of say 25 years by annual transfers from the budget. So that kind of development mechanism will have to be developed in Sri Lanka, and there have been in many countries they have done that, because in 1993 the Central Bank of the Philippines became bankrupt like this. So the liabilities of the Central Bank of the Philippines were transferred to a special purpose vehicle, which had to be written off for a period of 25 years and they actually they were annually written off until year 2018 by annual transfers from the budget as well as annual profits from the new central bank. So similarly, what should happen is that we have to transfer these losses to a special purpose vehicle. We'll have to require the new ventures to make profits, and out of those profits, we have to transfer some portion of their profit to the special purpose vehicle to write off the accumulated losses. Thereby, we can free the citizens or the taxpayers of the country from taking the burden of this institution. So this is a major management reform that the government will have to introduce, in my view, Jaimal.
Doctor, I want to also talk to you about debt restructuring. We know that we are making some progress in terms of speaking to external stakeholders when it comes to external debt restructuring. However, now since the staff level agreement has been reached, the authorities are maintaining radio silence on internal debt restructuring. If such a decision is made, Doctor, how detrimental will it be for Sri Lanka's economy?
Well, of course, Jayamal, with respect to the foreign debt, already government is planning to restructure the commercial loans it has borrowed and the loans it has borrowed from the bilateral sources like individual countries. That comes to about, say, 24 billion of US dollars as at the end of year 2021. But there is, in addition to that, there is about, say, 11 billion US dollar borrowing facility contracted by the government of Sri Lanka from multilateral agencies, and that also should be restructured because Sri Lanka doesn't have any foreign exchange to do that. So the current program of the government is to restructure only part of the debt liabilities and not all the debt liabilities. But you are specifically asking whether the domestic debt of the government should also be restructured. Now, if it comes to the sustainability of the debt of any country, the definition is that if the country can, in the case of domestic debt, if the country can borrow from the market in order to repay the old debt and also to pay the interest without getting the central bank of the country to print new money, the debt is sustainable. In the case of Sri Lanka, this has not been the case in the past, but of course the new management in the central bank had tried its best to borrow everything from the market by increase the interest rate. But we find, Jayamal, in the last two auctions of the Treasury Bill and Treasury bonds, the central bank had been able to get only about, say, 60 to 65% from the market. The balance had to be funded by the central bank. So what it means is we are in a very precarious situation. If the IMF decides that Sri Lanka's domestic debt is also not sustainable and it should be restructured before IMF considers any request from Sri Lanka for a loan facility, that will be, it has very negative impact on the entire financial sector as well as the economy of the country. Because in my view, if the domestic debt is restructured, say treasury bills, you restructure by getting about, say, 30% of, say, haircut, the biggest casualty would be the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, which holds at present about 2.4 trillion Sri Lanka rupees worth of treasury bills. So 30% means central bank will become bankrupt immediately. Similarly, Employees Provident Fund, National Savings Bank, Bank of Ceylon, People's Bank. So we are heading towards a major financial crisis if that happens. So in my view, what the government should do is it should negotiate with the IMF, and also it has to prove to the IMF that domestic debt is sustainable and not unsustainable.
Right. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of tonight's program. We were joined by Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining me tonight and bringing to our attention very important factors and very important topics of discussion. Unfortunately, that's it.
Thank you very much, Jaimal.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. We now cross over to Primetime News on TV1. Take care, stay safe, and good night.